This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
This is Dialogue with Mae Brussel.
Hey, thank you all for joining. Welcome to May and the Magic Bullet. Tonight we have a interesting information-packed show, and we're going to talk about Mr. Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, and medical ethics and eugenics. And this comes partially from May's show on July 18th, 1980. And she talks about Nazis as is her idea to talk about Nazis a lot and their connections. And I'm just going to read what May has to say about her show. She says, "There's no safety in silence. You people that sit there and don't speak up or shout, I'll shout until I die. When I saw those people and I knew they died, I said I'd rather live 1 hour the way I'm living than to sit there like a zombie and let it happen and not to speak up. And that's why we're here today." And that is indeed why we're here today, to speak up and let it out, shout it out, what's going on. So we're going to start, and I need to lay some groundwork, because putting Mengele in context, that we tend to see these figures as being uniquely evil, or that there's something uniquely wrong with them, or that they're an anomaly in human behavior. But in a lot of cases, that's just not necessarily true. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how, like, the milieu of the time frame of the early 1900s, late 1800s, briefly, hopefully, and set the stage for his entrance. So this was a time of eugenics in America prior to World War I, during World War I, and then into World War II. And they had to rebrand after World War II, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But what is eugenics? Well, it's a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of human population by excluding certain genetic groups judged to be inferior and promoting other genetic groups judged to be superior. And it was coined by Francis Galton in 1883. And modern bioethicists who advocate the new eugenics describe it as a way of enhancing individual traits, regardless of group membership. So there was a lot of group membership issues back in the day, racist issues and others. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And modern bioethicists is a code word for modern eugenics, by the way. And 100 years ago or so, here's what was going on in America. The Indiana Supreme Court ruled in 1907 law unconstitutional in 1921, citing denial of due process under the 14th Amendment. So then they had a 1927 law that reinstated sterilization, adding court appeals. Approximately 2,500 total in-state custody were sterilized, and I believe that's in Indiana alone. So the governor, Otis R. Bowen, approved the repeal of all sterilization laws in 1974. And by 1977, the related restrictive marriage laws were repealed. So this was happening in our lifetime. And I don't know about you all. I was 10 years old when that was going on. Of course, I had no idea. And that's part of the value of May's work, is telling us what was actually going on in our lifetime. So this is a really good book, Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. It's by Harry Laughlin, and he talks about, it goes into a lot of detail. I think it was from the city of Chicago, published it, a report from the Psychopathic Laboratory of the Municipal Court of Chicago. So they're very, very into crime and preventing crime, much like Ronald Reagan in California back in the 60s and 70s. And you can see all about all of the states' different laws on eugenics and sterilization and other things in this book. I recommend you go take a look at it if you get a chance. So they had the American Eugenics Society, and I think, they rebranded it after World War II to molecular biology. But at the time, this Ottmar Freiherr von Verscher was the head of research at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And one of his proteges was Dr. Joseph Mengele. And this Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin was supported by the Rockefeller Medical Institute. The Rockefeller foundations supplied money to build the buildings and keep it running. And the big thing back then was that they wanted to do twins research. The Americans wanted to do twins research, but they couldn't really get away with it in America. So had this going in Berlin, and von Verschucher, a hero in American eugenics circles, functioned as the head of the institute. And Rockefeller funded that, continued both directly and indirectly through other research conduits during his early tenure. Verschucher's in 1935, he left the institute to form a rival eugenics facility in Frankfurt, and was much heralded in the American eugenics press. And they did research on twins, and research on twins in the Third Reich exploded because, of course, they had a ready-made population of slaves and captured people to research on. So this is backed by government decrees. And Verschucher wrote in Der Ehrbatz, a eugenic doctor's journal that he edited, that Germany's war would yield a total solution to the Jewish problem. And he had a longtime assistant, and his name was Joseph Mengele. And this is the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Racial Hygiene at the Free University of Berlin. But as you can see, this American Eugenics Society, it had a lot of really oligarchical, well-to-do members, including John D. Rockefeller Sr., John Foster Dulles. They were tied to the Race Betterment Foundation, Planned Parenthood. And here's Harry Laughlin, the guy from Chicago who wrote the book. And then these people the Dodges were industrialists. And I dropped a few of these people out here so you can see if you wanted to go on the board and check them out. The industrialists of their ages. So of their age, like the Zuckerbergs and the Gates and so connected to JP Morgan and Rockefeller and the Dulles family. So high social standing families, and eugenics was a thing. And that's just what they did and supported at the time. Now, this video, Eugenics, a Historical Perspective, if you get a chance, the Eugenics Record Office is at Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island. And they did a lot of research there, and that's well funded even today. And this historical perspective, this guy who gives a speech will blow your mind. The things that he says that he thinks are okay. So it's still going on, and making the connections and tracing this line back from the early 1900s to modern day through Mengele is the journey we're going to try to take today. So in 1927, this is Bell versus Buck. So this is the Supreme Court. And this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, and they validated sterilization in America. That was the law in 27. So he said it's better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing in their kind. The principle that sustained compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting through the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, he says. And here are some remedies for eugenic remedies that have been proposed as means for promoting or affecting the desired ends. So segregating people during their reproductive period, sterilization, restrictive marriage laws and customs, eugenics education of the public and prospective marriage mates, systems of mating purporting to remove defective traits, general environmental betterment, polygamy, euthanasia, neo-Malthusian doctrine, artificial interference to prevent contraception, and laissez-faire. Which one of these shall be applied? Shall one or two or several or all be made to operate? What are the limitations and possibilities of each remedy? Shall one class of the socially unfit be treated with one remedy and another with a different one? Shall the specifically selected remedy be applied to the class or to the individual? What are the principles and limits of these strategies? So they were really suffering for medical ethics back in the early 1900s. And I would say that they're really suffering for that today as well. So this is all in like a precursor and a run up to the Nazi racial hygiene laws. And let's see. Yeah, I got that. So they had a program, a euthanasia program called the T4, and it was T4 because it was Tiergartenstrasse 4 was the place where it originated. So on a building in a street at some German office. And it was framed as a euthanasia program to kill incurably ill, physically or mentally disabled, or emotionally distraught and elderly people. And Hitler initiated the program in 1939, and it was officially discontinued in 1941, but they continued killings covertly until their defeat in 1945. And once the program came out, it was directed from that Berlin address at Tiergartenstrasse Street 4 and involved virtually the entire German psychiatric community. So these medical professionals who, assuming they took the Hippocratic Oath or they were bound to help people, they were all involved in the psychiatric community. And that new bureaucracy headed by physicians was established with a mandate to kill anyone deemed to have a life unworthy of living. Some physicians active in the study of eugenics who saw Nazism as applied biology enthusiastically endorsed the program. However, the criteria for inclusion in the program were not exclusively genetic, nor were they necessarily based on infirmity. Important criterion was economic. The Nazi officials assigned people to this program largely based on their economic productivity. They referred to the program's victim as burdensome lives or useless eaters. So pay attention to those terms. You might see them again in our program. And so the program's personnel killed people at first by starvation and then by lethal injection, and later chose asphyxiation by poison gas. So the physicians oversaw the gassings in the chambers disguised as showers using lethal gas to kill by chemists. And they had 6 killing centers, and the SS staff in charge of the transports donned white coats to keep up the charade of a medical procedure. Program staff informed victims' families of the transfer to the killing centers. Visits, however, were not possible, and the relatives then received condolence letters, falsified death certificates signed by physicians, and urns containing the ashes. And the transformation of physicians into killers took time, required the appearance of scientific justification. And soon after the Nazis came to power, the Bavarian Minister of Health proposed that psychopaths, the mentally retarded, and the inferior people be isolated and killed. And this policy has already been initiated at our concentration camps. He noted a year later, authorities instructed mental institutions throughout the Reich to neglect their patients by withholding food and medical treatment. And to me, that sounds very familiar to some of the things that have happened here recently. And indeed, this comes from August 17th, 2022. Will future Canadians owe the disabled an apology for euthanasia? So here's a story of 61-year-old Alan Nichols, who requested and received euthanasia less than a month after entering a British Columbia hospital in June 2019. He was suffering from suicidal thoughts, dehydration, and malnutrition. And the decision was apparently based on a medical history that included serious but typically non-life-threatening conditions such as depression and hearing loss. His grief-stricken family had sought explanations as to how doctors could have found their loved ones competent to choose death, much less needful of it. Somebody needs to take responsibility so that it never happens to another family. And the family's inquiries to provincial and federal authorities have so far produced only official insistence that Allen met the criteria for physician-assisted deaths. So Canada is right up the Nazi alley with euthanasia, and you get depressed, you can choose death in Canada. I heard a story on a podcast of a soldier veteran who was suffering from PTSD, and he went into his doctor's office, the psychiatrist's office, and the psychiatrist offered him assisted suicide, euthanasia, for his PTSD. Well, I guess that's one way to cure it, to take care of it. So is this unusual? Is this something that you wouldn't expect to see at the high levels of society? Well, let's see what Yuval Noah Harari has to say. He's a leading advisor for Klaus Schwab and the author of several books about the Great Reset. He's praised by the likes of Klaus, Obama, Zuckerberg, Gates, and they reviewed his latest book on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. And he also speaks at the World Economic Forum at Davos, for the New York Times, for Stanford, for TED, and Times Talks. And at this writing, his books occupy the top 2 slots on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. And he says history began when humans invented gods and will end when humans become gods. But not all humans, as he makes clear in the video, only the non-useless ones who go along with transhumanism. So the biggest question maybe in economics and politics for the upcoming decades, he says, will be what to do with all these useless people. The problem is more boredom, and what to do with them, and how will they find some sense of meaning in their life when they're basically meaningless and worthless. My best guess at present is that the combination of drugs and computer games is a solution for most. It's already happening. I think once you're superfluous, you don't have power. So he goes on to outline transhumanist vision for the future, computer brain interfaces, and human relationships become more meaningless due to artificial substitutes. But the poor die, but the rich don't. So this commentator points out that transhumanism, boiled down to its bones, is pure eugenics. It calls itself H2, H plus, for more or better than human, which of course is what eugenics is all about. Alarmingly, transhumanist values are being embraced at the highest strata of society, including big tech, universities. Among the Davos crowd of globalists would-be technocrats. That being so, it's worth listening to what they are saying under the theory that forewarned is forearmed. So I don't know about you, but I think I'm seeing a pattern here. So let's go back up to Mengele. So here at this time enters our protagonist, Mr. Mengele. So he was born in 1911 in Günzburg, Germany, and he was a popular and rich child who was born into an industrial family at a time when the economy was cratering. So this was just before World War I, and he grew up in the Great Depression and the collapse of the Weimar Republic. And he was a very sharp, smart, stylish type of guy. And this is about the time when May starts talking about him. She decided to go back on air in July 18th of 1980 because somebody out in her community who she had been sending tapes to her sent her a FOIA request of Mengele's file from the FBI. And I think that file was done in 1966, and it talked about like how they just kind of let him go. But she was so impressed that somebody was doing research outside, and that was her idea, to use the community of researchers to create more and better information so they could learn and protect and change society for the better. She was threatened off the air, I believe, in 1978. So she'd been off for death threats for that period of time. So here's Mengele, and in 1932, he becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen. So he has U.S. citizenship. And in Germany, he gets a degree in philosophy, and he passes his medical boards, comes from a high-level German industrial family, and he joins up with the SS. So that's the brown shirts, and you can see them here. And they were one of the paramilitary organizations that catapulted Hitler into power. Now, I think Ernst Röhm was the leader of the brown shirts, and Hitler saw that he was getting a little bit too powerful. So they had the Night of the Long Knives, and I don't know exactly what year that was in. It might have been 34, where he went in and decapitated, murdered all the leaders of the brown shirts. And this is about the time when Mengele decides that, hey, maybe that's not such a good idea to be in the brown shirts. But I see this group, the SS, the Schutzstaffel, and they're Hitler's Praetorian Guard. They look like they're going to be a better bet than the SA. So he signs up and goes through the process to become the SS. And then when the war breaks out, he is sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets in Ukraine. And I think he was a medical officer actually on the Eastern Front, but the things that he saw over there were absolutely horrific. The SS and the NKVD Soviet troops were fight to the death, hand-to-hand combat, and no mercy anywhere, and no telling what atrocities he witnessed and participated in Eastern Ukraine as a SS officer. But he was wounded at the front in 1942 and was sent back to Germany to recuperate, and was deemed unfit for combat. So then he was assigned as the camp doctor for Auschwitz, and that's where he begins his experiments on twins. And the strange thing that May didn't really understand was, why was he not sought at Nuremberg? And she says that he was an American citizen, and that might have been why he wasn't tried as a war criminal. And she believes that he was in Las Vegas in 1966. And she also, and some of the other research, points to him as being the mind control officer at Jonestown, and we'll read a little bit more about that. But his primary area of, if you can call it research, was really experimentation on helpless prisoners, was for twins. And I think this quote is kind of telling of his attitude and the Nazi attitude, and really what we've seen globally here recently is, the more we do to you, the less you seem to believe we are doing it. So the lie and the tyranny and the abuse and the torture is so bad that people can't even believe that it's going on. And he's mainly remembered for his actions at Auschwitz or Birkenau, the concentration camp where he did deadly experiments on prisoners, and a member of the team of doctors who selected victims to be killed or experimented on. So the prisoners have stories of him standing all finely dressed in his Nazi uniform on the platform as the train pulled up, looking for twins, and then using his index finger to point who was going to the gas chamber and who was going to going for experiments and who was going to go for slave labor. So he was sorting people based on the characteristics that he witnessed at the deembarkation center, where they were pouring people out of the trains into the death camps, hence his title, Angel of Death. And he had a fascination with twins, but as you heard, the American Eugenics Society had that fascination with twins as well. They were funding his job site, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, and Rockefeller was providing funding for all that research. Do we think that all stopped? Like when the war kicked off, the Washington Post and the New York Times seemed to think so, but I know that Standard Oil was still supplying the Nazis with oil, much like Russia is supplying LNG through China to Europe right now, even though they're in a boycott or sanctioned. So maybe there was funding still flowing, but the research that he was doing was horrific. They talk about keeping the twins in separate barracks where they're fed better to keep them alive or make sure they didn't fall ill. And he subjected them to experiments the people had no idea what the objectives of the experiments were, and they were performed without anesthesia, transfusion of blood from one twin to another, isolation, endurance, reaction to various stimuli, injections with lethal germs, sex change operations, removal of limbs and organs, and incestuous impregnations. But really, he was fascinated with creating the master race and with the twins. And also, they talk about how he is fascinated with the color of the eyes. So that they wanted to raise blonde-haired, blue eyes Aryans. And so he did a lot of like eye experiments, and he would send the kids back to their parents or send them to their death with one eye cut out or trying to change the eye color. So it was pretty gruesome what he was up to. We'll get into a little bit more of that without going too overboard. But here he is with his fellow concentration camp people. This is Richard Baer, the last commandant of Auschwitz, on the right, and here's Mengele on the left here in this picture. And I thought this picture was interesting, and I was trying to see if it rang true to me. But they're saying that as a young person, which it looks like maybe they're I don't know, maybe in their 20s and 30s, but that he was photographed with Otto Skorzeny, with Reinhard Gehlen, and Martin Bormann. And if you haven't had experience with the Nazi connections, these were all high-level intelligence agents, finance minister, or commandos. Skorzeny was a commando. Reinhard Gehlen was an intelligence officer for the East Soviet Union sphere. And then Martin Bormann was the Reich finance minister. So he took care of all the money, and he distributed out to the flight capital out of Germany. When they figured out that they were going to lose the war, he created all these shell companies internationally and funneled all the money out through IG Farben and other companies. So all of these guys actually survived the war, from what I can tell, and prospered after the war. So that's another set of stories. But yeah, this says that, Mengele was interested in people with different eye colors, with different irises, and the etiology and treatment of gangrene disease in gypsies. And the first phase of experiments, pairs of twins and persons with inherited anomalies were put at the disposal of Mengele, subject to all imaginable specialist medical examinations, photographed, plaster casts were placed on their jaws and teeth, and toe and fingerprinted. And as soon as the examinations were finished, they were killed with lethal injection of phenol to the heart, so that the next phase of experimentation could begin autopsies and comparative analysis of their internal organs. So I don't know, like, this kind of talks about that's the way it was for all of the victims. But I can imagine there were several paths to follow after you had been experimented on. And if they wanted your body for further experiments, then probably this is the way it would go. So let's see if I can get to the right spot here. There we go. Okay, so what are rat lines? Well, rat lines after the war, and I'll read this, that Mengele fled to Argentina in July of 1949. So he was assisted by a former SS members. That's the Odessa network, and it was heavily subsidized by the Pope and the Catholic Church. There's a large expatriate Nazi community in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and it was known as rat lines, how people, war criminals, escaped from Nazi Germany. And so others that went through the rat lines: Adolf Eichmann, Klaus Barbie, Gustav Wagner, Edward Roschmann, war criminals, basically torturers, murderers, etc., who were able to escape through these rat lines, and they were assisted by other Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. The thing about Mengele is, he was being chased down supposedly by West Germany, Israel, and other Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal. They wanted to bring him to justice. but he somehow eluded capture in spite of the Mossad, in spite of extradition requests, and drowned in 1979 after suffering a stroke while swimming in Brazil. And he was operating under the 4 false names. Wolfgang Gerhard, they said he was buried under, but he had a bunch of different false names. And May talks about him being involved in Jonestown and programming people up at Ukiah. And then she also talks about the Colonial Dignidad, which was a Jonestown type camp in Peru or Chile, and potentially being involved with Andres Strasbourg in Paraguay, and the dictators in South America to assist them with their torture and mind control exercises. And that he was continuing his research all the way up until 1979 and basically untouched. So if they wanted to find him, do you think that the Mossad and CIA could have found him? Yeah, maybe. So of course you all are probably familiar with Operation Paperclip, where there's precedent for these scientists being used, and basically the whole United States space program in the 60s was run by former Nazis. And Mengele, and here he is with his son in 1977, and this is according to the Daily Mail in the UK. A picture of him here. They're saying that unlike other SS officers, he didn't have his blood type tattooed on his arm or chest to keep his skin unmarred, and it would have been a dead giveaway for the Americans that they had a potential war criminal. Instead, he fled through the rat line of safe houses set up by Nazi sympathizers to the Italian port of Genoa, boarded the North King passenger ship bound for Argentina, and then through Argentina, Paraguay, and finally Brazil. He lived, worked, even managed a small farm. And he employed some techniques that he brought over from his experiments, performed on humans. And although aware and fearful of the Nazi hunters, he lived simply but with relative freedom until he drowned while swimming. That sounds like a really nice story. I don't believe it. I think that he was probably involved in these other MK Ultra type exercises that were going on globally. So let's talk about his potential involvement there in MK Ultra. So May thought that he was involved in Jonestown, and this comes from another author, Brian Desborough, and he says that Jonestown was a CIA experiment to determine whether it was possible to establish a large mind control slave labor force, which kind of makes sense. And we've talked about Jonestown and Jim Jones before, that he was a CIA operative and former housing commissioner for San Francisco. So Tim Stone was assigned the task of procuring state mental patients and transferring their guardianship to the People's Temple, where they could be experimented on. So that sounds a little bit like the Nazi racial hygienics laws. And Jones was assisted by Dan Mitrione, the torture specialist, contract CIA operative from South America, who instructed Brazilian and Bolivian security personnel in advanced torture and interrogation techniques. So prior to the purchase of Guyana, the entire staff of the Mendocino State Mental Hospital were dismissed and replaced by Jim Jones's personnel. And according to mind control survivors, Mengele program inmates there at that time period. And one member of Jones' staff at Mendocino was allegedly the mother of O.J. Simpson. This author says that might make sense because observing him at trial, you could see him flipping back and forth between his altered personalities. So this author says that, hey, it's customary for offspring of Illuminati initiates to be programmed to perpetuate the organization, and mind control techniques were elevated to new scientific level during World War II by the Auschwitz angel of death, Joseph Mengele. And he subjected infants to prolonged intense torture to force the minds of the children to split into several thousand altered personalities. And then he was covertly brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. So there's a little bit of conflicting information. Some say he went to Argentina, and this says he went to the United States. But And there's some horrible stuff about what they did to children. And when we talked with Juliet Engel, who had been subject to satanic ritual abuse and traumatic mind control during MK Ultra in California, these are the types of things that she described. It's induced trauma. It's a lot of sexual abuse, forced observation of execution of expendable children. Many mind control victims are offspring of multi-generational satanic cult families, and others are children of military fathers who knowingly permit their children to become mind control victims in order to further their own careers. Numerous child care centers are involved in the satanic cult and mind control activities, and we covered some of this with the Presidio daycare and other, the West Point daycare and other child care centers where the kids said, hey, we've been abused by Satanists. And in fact, talking with May's daughter, Barbara, last week, she said that General or Colonel Michael Aquino told May to stop investigating the Presidio or you would regret it. And she was dead like 6 or 8 weeks later. So she was directly threatened by Michael Aquino. And, you don't, okay, so this, you don't think that this is happening, but this is Project Artichoke from MK Ultra. And this is their goal, to get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, even against the laws of nature, such as self-preservation. And what if we try all these different methods on them? I think we're seeing more and more of this in mainstream media with mind-controlled shooters out there, and known to the FBI, I think is the statement that they make. So let's talk about a few other sociopaths. So this is Bertrand Russell. Let's do this first. So scientists have discovered that people will believe anything when you claim scientists have discovered it. Science and only science describes the world as it is, the elimination of the psychological and spiritual dimension of experience. So that's what Yuval Harari is talking about. Human relationships don't mean anything. And Tony the Needle Fauci says attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science. So it's scientism. And there's some other sociopaths that talk about that during the 60s. And one of them is Bertrand Russell. He says by diet, injections, and injunctions will combine to form from a very early age to produce a sort of character and sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable. And any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible, even if all are miserable and all believe themselves to be happy, because the government will tell them that they are so. That sounds very familiar. And here's Aldous Huxley, and he says there will be a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing a dictatorship without tears, producing a kind of painless concentration camp so people will have their liberties taken away, but will rather enjoy it. Well, I don't think people are enjoying it, but they're certainly being taken away. So these are the types of sociopaths who are working on these problems. Chris made this meme for me. We're all living in Jonestown now, so just don't drink the Kool-Aid. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Do not drink the Kool-Aid. So what came out of Mengele, right, and World War II and these medical experiments? And it was, it wasn't just him. It wasn't just the Germans. And as you can see, the United States was heavily involved in these experiments after World War II. We have a pretty good knowledge of that, MK Ultra, other experiments that were going on. So I want to read this like word for word, but I think I'm going to cut it down just a little bit. But I think the first point, and this is the Nuremberg Code that came out of the judge's verdict from on medical experimentation after World War II, specifically the German medical experimentation. So the first point of the code is that voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have a legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any force fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, like being able to go to your job, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This later element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality and consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. So I don't know how more relevant that statement could be to what's been happening recently. So let's go to number 4. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. Number 5, no experiment should be conducted where there's an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. The degree of risks, number 6, to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Proper preparation should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even the remotest possibility of injury, disability, and death. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons with the highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiments. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he reaches the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him impossible. And during the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe in the exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, death, or to the experimental subject. So a homework assignment could go to look up the VAERS report and see how many people have been injured or died due to experimental shots that have recently been pushed by these, I hesitate to call them doctors. I think they're, snake oil marketing salesmen. Okay. So why Fauci? Why Klaus? Why Mengele? Why Rockefeller? Why Gates? Why Stalin, Mao? And why eugenics, transhumanism, racism, technocracy, and globalism? Why? What is that for? What is that all about? Well, Ernest Becker says that all power is in essence power to deny mortality. Either that or it is not real power at all, not ultimate power, not the power that mankind is easily or readily obsessed with. Power means power to increase oneself, to change one's natural situation from one of smallness, helplessness, finitude to the bigness, control, durability, and importance. So if you had all the money in the world and if you were a power seeker, you might want to make yourself immortal through transhumanism, and you might see yourself better than every other person that walks the earth. And you might actually get a charge out of showing that power by taking other people's lives. And I think a lot of that is what explains what's going on. So just a couple closing things. So the Dalai Lama says people were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. the reason why the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used. And Matthew 7:12 says, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. And that is our story through Mengele. Kind of serves as the spoke of this horrific story. What say you, audience? Any questions or comments? Quite a rant this evening.
Hey, Tim.
Hey,
Yeah,
Amos.
no, it's also very familiar. I mean, you're right to draw the connections between the world that we're living in today, and it just seems to keep continuing. So I really appreciate your research and the work you're doing. It's appreciated. So that's really all I have to say at this moment.
Thanks, Amos. I think, just trying to put some context around the who, what, why, when, and where, and that it's nothing new under the sun.
Tim, you mentioned kind of the rebranding of eugenics as bioengineering, and like how much of that industry is, because I do feel like there's a you've already seen some issues with I can't remember the lady's name that had the the blood test that's supposedly she could take with a drop. It was all just a complete sham. I think she brought up like a couple $1 billion in investment, but it was basically just bullshit. And I tend to believe that a great deal of the bioengineering that's going on is just to a large part baloney. But behind this genetic engineering that they're saying they're doing, but it's really just bullshit, if you ask me. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of these pharmaceutical companies are like children of IG Farben. So, this eugenic transhumanism, I think it's all the same thing. Like eugenics morphed into molecular biology, which morphed into transhumanism over time. And it goes back to trying to make humans into gods and make them immortal and perpetual. And I think the oligarchical classes have been obsessed with this probably since time immemorial. And the technology keeps improving, but the chances that they're going to catch up to the creator are pretty slim.
To say the least. Yeah, well, I think in a lot of ways there's a lot of propaganda in there that like the idea of the AI and the robots taking over and stuff like that, and essentially it being just robotizing humans and bringing them down to the level of essentially a programmable computer.
Well, they talk about that, right? She talks about Jonestown being and MK Ultra being a way to, and actually Aldous Huxley and Bertrand Russell and others, the Macy crowd and the MK Ultra crowd, about basically they're talking about creating deltas and epsilons and designer people that fulfill a task, and as part of the depopulation agenda to limit the number of those people, So only, the right people could breed and be truly human. And I don't know, like, if they're reserving humanity or human qualities for themselves, or if they'd be happy to transition into a machine. If they were able to transition their consciousness, transhuman like, into a machine, if that they would probably think that'd be better, because then they could live forever. Well, until you have a power outage. But I suppose the Tesla battery is going to take care of that, until it doesn't. Yeah. So strange cats, strange philosophies, ideologies, and lots of stuff coming down. It was coming down in May's day. Now it's coming fast and furious. And the technology that fits in our hand is, it's entrapping us, I think. So just things to be aware of.
Well, yeah, the mass mind control is
Are you
just something
thinking,
they've always tried to. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying mass mind control is something that, I mean, they've been trying to orchestrate since the 50s, at least, I think, at least with the technical advances they've been getting through, the military. And, you start looking at these Jolly West and Delgado and these people that are, they're doing it on an individual level and in many cases, but also they're also looking at mass mind control through technocracy. It's pretty scary, and you see that, or them trying to do that more and more today. At least they're talking it. So I mean, maybe Michael's got a point that maybe it's just all smoke and mirrors, and we're we're being terrified or something like that. But not that I am, but it's troubling, some of the stuff that you see that they really were actually able to do, some of this Manchurian type stuff, and then they're looking to do it in, at a greater mass level. So
Yeah. So I would encourage you to watch Darren Brown. He does a hypnotism where he programs somebody to shoot an actor in a theater with a fake gun. And he shows kind of how it can be done. And it just points right back to the Manchurian candidates, Sirhan. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. If you get a chance to check that out. And then that video on the Cold Spring Harbor is really frightening. What they say, and they think it's okay. Just like Yuval Harari, like these things come out of his mouth, and I guess they don't have any self-awareness that 99.9% of the planet is going to resist that kind of thing, where he's talking about putting down the herd, basically. And what we're the herd. That's the deal. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your feedback and the discussion. And I think next week we'll probably take up Son of Sam, and we can connect them back into these networks. It's made a lot of work on Son of Sam, and I'm in touch with Barbara Brussel now, and she's trying to preserve all of May's artifacts, like her research. They're in 2 storage cabinets. She needs a little help with the project. She has a team, but their researchers are not. They're not project teams. So looking forward to digging into that a little bit and trying to help out. So if you all think about ways to help, or you're interested, just reach out and we'll see what we can get going. But I really appreciate you all being here and participating, and it really provides a lot of motivation to keep going through this research and tie it back to what's happening today. And there's just so much value in what May delivered. And I think picking it apart, being able to see things visually, replaying it in a different way, and in a way, all of her research that she threw into 1 hour was almost impossible to consume in an hour unless you have the context. So trying to build context layer on layer on layer and just lay that mosaic down, like put another chip in the mosaic every time, every week as we go along, the big picture becomes more and more clear. And that's the idea. All right. Thanks for being here. We'll see you all next week.
Doing a great job. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Michael. We'll see you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Tim.